Okay, well, we're running a very tight ship today, which is obviously what Captain Stephen Roskill would have wanted. Welcome back. This conference is a celebration of the work of the Archive Centre team, past and present, and you've just heard from some of the past team members. But it's also a celebration of the work of our researchers, because without the researchers, there is little point in our keeping the material. You're the ones who analyse, interpret and publish our holdings. And we're very lucky to have had such wonderful archive spy fellows over the years from all over the country and all around the world, and working, as we'll see in this conference, on such a disparate range of projects and subjects. We heard in the first session from the very first archive spy fellow, Professor John Samida. He was the first, and then, of course, the title was Archives Fellow Commoner. Since then, since 1984, there have been almost 90 Archives Spy Fellows, and I'm really pleased to say that I think we have about 20 of you here in the room or online today and tomorrow. We do, though, note with great sadness the recent passing of Professor Josie Harris. Okay, so we're about to hear from three former Archive Spy Fellows who went on to have extremely distinguished academic careers. But before we do so, let's hear from the late Corelli Barnett about how and why this scheme came about.
Well, again, one of the things that I was concerned about when I first became keeper was that the Archive Centre did seem to be detached from the college in a way. It did its own thing, but I wanted to bring it into into the heart of college operations, and therefore that's why I proposed that we should have an Archives Fellow Commonership, and what it's called.
Archives Spy Fellowship now.
Spy Fellowship is even better promotion. And so there would then be a scholar for a term researching in the Archive Centre, but a member of the college dining with fellows and so forth. So that was one idea we had.
We have Professor Gaynor Johnson, Professor Emerita from the University of Kent. We have Dr. Graham Farmelo, familiar to many of you as a fellow of this college, and Professor Jim Muller, Professor Emeritus at the University of Alaska in Anchorage. So Jim, going to come to you first of all. I'm not going to do long introductions because the speaker biographies are available online on the website and also at our information point. But in each case, I'll just give a couple of salient facts to establish credentials. And in each case, I've asked the BIFellows to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes on their research, and then we will have questions. So we're going to go in chronological order. So Jim, going to come to you first. You've just retired as Professor of Political Science at the University of Alaska in Anchorage. So first of all, thank you for coming all of this way. I think you've come further than almost anyone else today. You first came here, I think, in 1995 as a BIFellow. Just as the Churchill papers were opening up in the aftermath of their purchase by the Heritage Lottery Fund, which we've been hearing about. You've written, taught, lectured extensively on Winston Churchill, and you've produced extremely comprehensive and definitive editions of some of his works, including most recently the definitive 2-volume edition of his account of his time in the Sudan as a young soldier and war correspondent in 1898, the River War. And it seems appropriate to start this session then with our founder, and I believe you're going to take us on a quick dive into Churchill's mind.
Well, thank you, Alan, and also my fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. it's delightful to come back to Churchill College 28 years after I first spent considerable time here as the Archives By Fellow in the Michaelmas term in 1995. And when I brought my wife Judith and our young daughter Helen to Cambridge with me that autumn, moving into the Shepherd Flats, which were the first part of the college that had been built, the chance to begin to gain a closer understanding of Churchill's life and thoughts began in a much smaller Churchill Archive Center under its keeper, Piers Brendan, who had just been joined by a young Alan Packwood. And as we moved into the flats, I remember that the first thing that the college did for us was to present us with a very lengthy list of all the wines and other fortified spirits that were available for purchase by the fellows, showing that the founders of the college had been diligent and in no way behindhand in making up for lost time in putting together a considerable cellar to match those in the older colleges in Cambridge, and also to meet the needs of the fellows, whose warm drinking at dinners in the senior common room certainly stretched and very far always exceeded my own experience of having been offered an occasional glass of sherry in college tutorials back in the United States, later washed down at dinner with iced water only, which of course Churchill considered to be a bleak beverage. I'm afraid that the college in those days was not quite so quick and acted with so much less alacrity in hooking us up to a newfangled thing called email, that during the entire Michaelmas term, I never had a successful access to my email while I was here. Things have changed considerably since then, I'm glad to say. And in those days, the Churchill papers, which I was eager to read for intelligence of how Churchill thought and wrote and put together such a remarkable shelf full of books that he wrote. Indeed, really having a parallel career in writing that, as Mary Soames always pointed out, was even longer than his political career, those papers had not been digitized. And it was a great feature of research in those days that notes had to be taken always carefully on yellow paper and always in pencil to protect the original documents from stray marks, because we were mostly reading the original documents. And that was before the widespread use of laptop computers for research and note-taking in the archives, and much before the use of the cameras in everyone's mobile phone to take photographs of the documents. And so one was actually seeing the papers that Churchill had used in writing and revising his speeches and writings. And as other researchers visiting Churchill College will know, the weeks of that autumn term flew by with very long days of reading in the reading room, opening files and making discoveries, along with writing later in the evening when the archives were closed, and occasional visits to other archives, scholars, and Churchill-related sites around England, especially on the weekends when the archives were closed. And I was working that autumn, especially to begin work on this new complete edition of the River War, Churchill's History of the War in the Sudan, which I discovered the need for that several years earlier on our wedding trip, which for any of those of you who are young and haven't been married yet, it was a 15-month wedding trip. And I recommend that length to anyone who can contrive to make it happen, as my wife somehow did. I was on a sabbatical, and she got a second master's degree at LSE, and I sat in the British Library, which was where I discovered that there was this longer edition of Churchill's book, which had been out of print since 1899, and which really needed to be brought back into print. But by the end of the bi-fellowship here at Churchill College, in the following decade, I'd learned the extent of the of the Churchill Archives Center's holdings on Churchill's work on that book, which was one of the books Churchill wrote by hand long before his whole factory of secretaries and silent typewriters and literary assistants had been assembled at Chartwell. And I benefited very much from advice from Piers Brendan and also from the growing knowledge of Alan Packwood, who was there in his first term of work. And later, on many return visits to the Archives Center, mostly in the summer, and several times leading groups of American secondary school teachers who were visiting the archives and learning about Churchill in seminars funded by the U.S. National Endowment for the Humanities. I worked again on the River War and on new annotated editions of Thoughts and Adventures and Great Contemporaries, and the beginnings of an annotated edition of My Early Life, a roving commission, which is finally due to be published next year by St. Augustine's Press. Piers Brendan then served as symposiarch. We gave him this fabulous Greek title for the symposium we had on Churchill's Life of Marlborough at Blenheim Palace. And Alan Packwood, of course, has organized and been a featured speaker at many international Churchill conferences and other Churchill-related panels and events arranged by members of the Board of Academic Advisors of the International Churchill Society around the world. Through that research and with encouragement of members of the Churchill family, and especially his youngest daughter, Mary, in conversations with other Churchill scholars, I've been able to form a picture of how Churchill worked on his books and speeches. His biographers, and there are many, have all drawn on them as a very rich resource. But I think sometimes biographers have exaggerated the importance of Churchill's lack of inherited wealth and his need for money as his prime motive for writing. Certainly he needed to write in order to keep his family in the style to which he wanted them to be accustomed, not to mention himself. And he used his writing as a way of ensuring his family's continuing fortunes. But Churchill's diligence and his enthusiasm and his insistence on revising his work always until he thought it was exactly right, even to the point of driving his publishers half mad with revisions. I think all of those things show that his prime motive for writing was not so much pecuniary, and nor was it self-advertising or even self-defense, though all those various motives certainly played a part in it, but rather it was a desire to know, a desire to get right to the bottom of a question that he really wanted to understand better. And that, of course, is the same aim of a liberal education in a university. I mean, the kind of an education that frees one's mind of conventional prejudices and jars loose whatever the fashions of the day are in order to try to find the truth, and opens it also to answering the kind of permanent questions human beings have to face. Why are we here? What can we accomplish while we're here? And how do we fit into this larger, more durable world in which all of us have our brief innings? And how can we make the best use of those? And I think Churchill's appeal as an example of all that comes to us largely because this man, who never did have a university education, was so determined to explore questions like that. Well, I want to end what I have to say with thanks after all these years for our experience at Churchill College and at the Churchill Archives Center, and just to thank them for all that they've given me and my family. For all of us, they've given us an appreciation of the thoughtfulness, the hospitality, and the tolerance in welcoming visitors from other countries who have, despite our sharing English as a common language, different ways of speaking and living. And we've learned much from you. I'm sure we have more to learn. Our daughter, Helen, who's with us today, had her very first experience of going to school when she was 3 or 4 here at Cambridge Nursery School, where she went every morning on the back of Judith's bicycle. And that fall, she learned about conkers and the games you can play with them. And later, of course, we learned to eat mince pies until we were half sick of them in December. Judith was consoled while we were here for not having a dog by walking the master's dog quite repeatedly. And I made friends with other researchers I met while I worked here and later when I came back. As we landed at Heathrow yesterday and made our way back to Churchill College with visits to Harrow School, Eton College, and the RAF Museum at Duxford, which took the whole day from when we landed at 7:15 to after dark, whereupon we came here and had our dinner and fell into bed. It was a long, memorable day after flying 2 flights from Alaska. It really drove home to me how much we owe to the Churchill Archive Center in opening up what Churchill, borrowing his words from a poem by Keats, which he had never read but was told about by Violet Asquith, called The Magic Casements of the Mind. Thank you.
Okay, well, Jim, it's great to see you back here, and Helen as well, and now is the time for Conkers, of course. I think what I'm going to do is to take perhaps maybe one question after each presentation, if there is a question specific to the speaker. Does anyone have a question specifically for Jim? Piers.
Jim, your wonderful edition of the River War may well convince you that Churchill was out to get at the truth, but practically every other book that he wrote was an exercise in narcissism and a desire to promote himself, surely.
Yes, so I've heard. As you can see, we had many wonderful conversations, and I look forward to continuing this one today and tomorrow, Piers.
Well, maybe we can push you just a little bit more on it, because actually I had a version of this question, perhaps not quite as blunt as Piers. But you say that Churchill's motivation was knowledge. But, of course, this is a man who stood up in the House of Commons in, I think, 1948, 49, and said that he thought it would be best for all parties to leave the past to history, especially as I propose to write that history myself, which suggests that there is a contemporary motivation for a lot of his writing as well. And I think that would also hold true of his various newspaper articles. So how do you see the balance? How much is it Churchill as historian? How much is it Churchill as contemporary political commentator?
Right. Well, I would be the last one to say that there is nothing in Churchill's works that is there for the reason Piers suggested. Everything in those works is there. There's a really funny story that I discovered in the Churchill Archive Center fairly recently, in the last few years, and I think it might have been pointed out to me either by Piers or Alan, and that was After Churchill wrote his autobiography, My Early Life, in 1930, he ended one of the chapters on his experience in trying to fight the rebellious tribesmen in what's now the borderland between Pakistan and Afghanistan, with a little metaphor of the beaver who builds his dam, finds it's all swept away in the flood, and has to start again after Churchill had failed to get to the campaign he wanted to at first there. And he mentions the beaver finds his dam and his fishes and everything else washed away. And somebody in Canada read this book and realized that Churchill must have thought that beavers ate fish, which they don't, and wrote him a very funny letter setting the record straight. But I don't think Churchill ever revised the end of that chapter to reflect it. But of course, there are much more serious questions which have been raised by serious scholars about the accuracy and of what Churchill wrote. And there's no question that these books, and especially the Great World War multi-volume histories, were intended by Winston Churchill to be his monument and part of the legacy he left, along with all these other books he wrote. But I think, again, that one of the key things he's trying to show us in these books, including by the way he wrote them and even by what he put in and what he left out, is what a statesman has to do in order to succeed and to get to the position which he thinks will allow him to do what's best for his country and best for himself. And I think these books do show a kind of connection between the practical choices statesmen have to make when they don't know what's going to happen next, which is always the situation, and the judgment afterward. And that does seem to be one of the big differences between academic history written by somebody afterward and the kind of memoir or autobiographical history, which many, though not all, of Churchill's books are, that he seems to be trying to, in these books, replicate the situation in which he had to make judgments about what to do next at each stage. And he certainly admits occasionally that he made the wrong choice and why. But in other cases, it may be much easier to be a Monday morning quarterback if you can make the choices long after you see how things turned out.
Right. Thank you, Jim. And you've set us up very nicely, I think, for our next speaker and our next presentation. Because, of course, Graham, you used the Archive Centre extensively for your research, for your book on Churchill's Bomb. Absolutely wonderful book. And which I loved for the way that it does exactly this. It's looking at these very difficult decisions that the politicians and the scientists are facing. And it interweaves their stories so that you can see it from both sides, which of course maximizes the use of the archive here, which is absolutely wonderful. You've also used us to research your biography of the mathematician Paul Dirac. Now you're working on the biography of Stephen Hawking. Sadly, those papers got away from us. They're with Jess at the University Library, which is a very, very good home for them. But perhaps then you can now tell us something about your work and the sort of archival challenges you faced on these projects.
Shall I go to
Yep.
No, fine, thank you. Thank you, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here. No documents, no history. That apparently is a phrase commonly used by French historians, first written down that phrase in 1898, I hear. Here are two people who certainly would agree with that aphorism. Sir Winston himself and his the former president, Harry Truman. Truman himself was committed to setting up his own presidential library, did a lot of fundraising for it, and showed his commitment to archives. So one can imagine what he felt like around Christmas 1955, when, according to his son Chris, he came home and saw his wife Bess putting whole sheaves full of their correspondence into the fire. He said to her, you shouldn't do that, Bess. I went with the American accent. And she replied, according to Chris, I've read them several times. And he said to her, but have you considered history? I have, Harry, I have, was her reply. For the scientists among us, what's particularly resonant there is that Helen Ducash, Einstein's secretary, was doing precisely the same thing by bomb-firing inconvenient letters soon after he died in 1955. What I want to do, as Alan set me up very nicely, is to just talk about my interaction with archives in general, in particular with our wonderful centre here. I've been in the archive business now for about 20 years. I've always felt, to use an overused phrase, somewhat of an imposter in this. I'm not a historian, a renegade theoretical physicist, extremely interested in physics, and with an unfashionable, and someone would say somewhat lowbrow interest in the interplay between the solid science and the humanity of the people involved, and also as a way of using that juxtaposition to illuminate the science for a wider public. I think it was in 2009 that I don't know. I still don't remember in detail the origins of the project, but I got interested in the relationship of Winston Churchill and nuclear weapons. Something I hadn't heard about or read about very much, and there didn't seem to be a book about it. So I thought this might be of interest, especially as Churchill seemed to be using the work of many physicists and other scientists in developing the first nuclear projects. So I came to Churchill College, where one of the first things I saw was this picture, very improbable, bearing in mind Churchill's apparent aversion to science, and in particular his horror of mathematics, which he set out in his memoir, wearing a white coat and even some unbecoming white shoes here, right next to our former master. Here we are, John Cockcroft. And Churchill, by this time, was well known to be almost obsessive about nuclear weapons, in particular the hydrogen bomb, and he was quite happy, Churchill, to take time off from the Christmas celebrations to visit Harwell here. This was one of the things that got me really interested. I thought there must be something deeper to Churchill's apparent, allegedly Philistine attitude to science. There must be something deeper that one can find out, and there's no better place to do that, of course, than in the Archive Centre, where we have such a wonderful collection of his papers. And I was enabled in that endeavour by 2 biofellowships funded by the Churchill Memorial Trust, and I'm deeply grateful to them for that. I must admit, even before I came here, I found out something that truly astonished me, and I still can't quite get over it. This is Winston Churchill in April 1925, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. And people that knew him well knew that he did have an influence, apart from these horrifying school teachers, in his knowledge of science. That's H.G. Wells, whose books he always read twice. And the other one was Frederick Lindemann, an unpopular physicist at the University of Oxford, one of his closest friends and, if you like, an informal science advisor. What I remember, eyes popping out, dreadful cliche, but I couldn't help it when I heard that a year after this was taken, almost exactly a year, when he was writing a key budget around the time of the general strike, that he took a morning off, right? Not to look at his papers, we didn't have spreadsheets in those days, but he took a morning off at Chartwell to write a summary of quantum theory. He'd been given a book by Lindemann called Atoms and Rays by Oliver Lodge, and he wrote about 8 pages to summarize what was then, without question, the hottest topic in theoretical physics, the invention of the most revolutionary theory of the 20th century. And here was Churchill doing that. Imagine Rachel Reeves, imagine Jeremy Hunt taking a whole morning off from their budget and reading about trying to write a summary of quantized field theory. I mean, that is what we're talking about. You don't expect somehow that to happen. But it did, and it's a pretty decent summary which he sent to Lindemann. When I arrived in the archive centre, they probably realised I wasn't the most knowledgeable Churchillian, and I remember one Alan Packwood giving me a reading list on the first day, and I'm very grateful for that list. It was very useful. I wish I had it a bit earlier, but it was extremely useful. But it was not just Alan, but his wonderful colleagues who helped to usher me around the various nooks and crevices of this archive, which is where many of the most illuminating parts of my book were discovered. One of them I remember, I still don't remember how I came across it, I think it was by accident, was the fact that Churchill was, I think, unarguably the most prominent science and technology commentator in Britain in the early 1930s. Is that an exaggeration? Well, the News of the World, millions of readers. He had about 8 articles on themes about the elusive atom and about the discovery of nuclear energy. These were, of course, partially ghosted by Lindemann, but Churchill, without question, tweaked those articles and took an active interest in them. I remember on the last day of that stint, my first biofellowship here, when Andrew Riley pointed me to the existence of press cuttings about Churchill, and I was pretty much exhausted by that time, and I saw what is still the most extraordinary thing I've ever come across in an archive by a politician. Right. To anyone who's a physicist with any acquaintance of physics in this great city, you'll know that 1932 was a banner year for physics because of the work done in the Cavendish laboratory. 3 great experiments done there. The splitting of the atom, colloquially speaking, the discovery of the neutron, and the discovery of cosmic ray showers. Now, what politician could possibly be interested in that? Well, the answer is Winston Churchill. A few months after that year ended, he chaired a discussion of those discoveries in a London soiree. And I remember, I thought, I wonder if the staff are winding me up here. This can't be true. 2 independent reports of that one here, the better of the 2, the splitting the atom there from the Daily Telegraph the day after it was given. So these sorts of discoveries only possible, in my view, by coming to a place not just with the archives that we have here, but with the archivists who know how to just point one in the right direction. I came to that project from my previous one, which was something perhaps more predictable, which is what you might call a cradle-to-grave account of the life of Paul Dirac. Paul Dirac is one of the greatest physicists of the past century. Was professor of physics here at Cambridge and one of the co-discoverers of that most revolutionary theory of the 20th century. I was a bit shaken at first because when I disclosed to my friend Martin Rees that I was writing a biography of Paul Dirac, he emailed me, and I still treasure this email, saying, "Don't do it. He is just too boring." In the words of Tom Stoppard, Dirac was regarded as simply a stick figure. I confess, and again, only someone of stupendous ignorance would do such a thing. I agreed to write that biography before I even knew there was an archive. Well, again, I can barely believe I'm admitting that in public, but it is absolutely true. Dirac left his papers to this college, courtesy of his friend Sir John Cockcroft. But then Dirac's wife, after he died, had them shipped out to the city where they spent their retirement at Florida State in Tallahassee, who incidentally were very helpful to me, but of course, out of all loyalty, of course, I wish they'd remained in full there. What surprised me most was that historians had been through that archive, but what they had completely ignored was that a tranche of letters spanning about 15 years from Dirac's mother to Paul Dirac, which completely illuminated the young life of Dirac, right? Dirac, there was a conventional narrative that this person had absolutely no interest, no small talk, no interest in the arts, no life at all outside quantum mechanics and relativity theory. The biggest surprise to me, and this is something while we're honouring the formal archives, is that the most stunning archival discovery there was in an airing cupboard in a suburb of Los Angeles. I found out that when visiting Dirac's younger daughter that she had some material that might surface when her house had been restored, but I had to wait 2 years to see it. And again, this was another of the great moments in my development as a writer on this. When I came down to breakfast the morning after arriving in a home just outside Los Angeles, and she said that might be of interest, a little brown box about so big. And in there were about 60 love letters between Paul Dirac and his soon-to-be fiancée, Mancy. A person totally different from him, very exuberant, a hater of all objective evaluations of anything, very talkative and a gift for friendship. So this woman, who was his antiparticle, married him and brought out his personality, which I think it's accurate to say was completely unknown to the historians who had parroted the simple view of Dirac as a stick figure. Here's Dirac and his wife. Notice his left hand using a remote-controlled camera so that people don't see them when they're on their honeymoon. Here's one of those letters. In the reviews of the book and subsequently, these are the things that people comment on. Dirac trying to woo his wife in the way that only Dirac did. When she complained that he didn't reply to her questions, he enumerates the questions and then lists his replies one by one. What a charmer the Dirac is. Do you still miss me a little? He writes, sometimes. What a guy. Anyway, it was a privilege to me to be able to make Dirac a more accessible figure and to give him his due as one of the great scientists of the past century. I have to say that after that, I thought bearing in mind the luck I'd had that, and luck is a big part of writing biographies, believe me, that was it. I would never have that luck again with his mother's letters and with the correspondence between him and his wife. But never say never. Just as I was finishing my book, The Universe Speaks in Numbers, I was asked if I would be interested in writing the authorised biography of this gentleman you may know, Stephen Hawking. Hawking is one of Dirac's successors as a Lucasian professor, in some ways the opposite of Dirac. Dirac, it's very, very common to hear theoretical physicists say, well, Dirac is, we know far too little about him and he's underrated. Whereas with Hawking, there's this feeling that there's too much said about him in the media, and of course a very, very different character to Dirac. This person is absolutely not a stick figure, is a larger-than-life character, one who remembered for many years. This time, Martin Rees was encouraging, and I actually took his advice this time and decided to take on the project. But I didn't know, right, the family had given me prior access to their unsalted archive, which I was very grateful for, but what I didn't know was whether we would have any information about what I regard as absolutely essential period in anyone's life, which is their formative years. I think it was Holden Caulfield who called it that David Copperfield crap, the stuff that people just flick over at the beginning of a biography. But if it's done well, that's when you learn about the formation of a character. And I didn't know whether that was going to be available. Mercifully, it was, and to my immense surprise, what turned out to be available, and there was no reason why this would be the case, I know and future biographers will have access to papers where his mother and father talk about him from the moment he was born, and I mean the moment he was born, right, right up to his coming here to Cambridge and being diagnosed with motor neuron disease. And about a quarter of the book is an extremely well-documented account which benefits from people who knew him, not least his family and his closest friends. But that book is due to be, will be handed over a week today. And I've got to say, if I never hear the word Stephen Hawking again, I'd be quite happy, actually, after the past 5 years of doing nothing but research that book. But it has been a great privilege to work, particularly with my colleagues at the University Library, who've been fantastically helpful, even with the challenges of COVID, which was a trial for everyone, of course. So I just wanted to say some final thoughts. Obviously, my thanks to my colleagues and my teachers in the Churchill Archive Centre, and all my colleagues here at college. I was interested in the fascinating talk this morning about the history of the college and how about the initial resentment of having an archive centre here in college. Well, for me, it was a work of genius to put as a unique selling point, as the Disney people say, in the middle of this college, an archive centre, which is the hope diamond of a gem in the centre of our college now. A fantastic addition to it, and something that makes it, helps to contribute to its uniqueness. And I wish them well for the next 50 years, where, of course, they're going to make the full transition to a time when there will be hardly any written documents, but they will be digital documents. And, of course, the digital age brings with it threats and opportunities, the huge plethora of information that people don't want shared. And, of course, the ease of copying means that it's going to be much harder to incinerate information. So the Bess Trumans and the Helen Ducashes of the world better watch out, because there's going to be a lot more information lasting a lot longer. But I'm sure that our colleagues will be up to that challenge, and I look forward to looking at their success in future. For the moment, my own motto is no archives, no biographies. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Graham, thank you very much. It's great to know that at least one fellow of the college is extremely positive about the Archive Centre at the moment. I don't think you're going to get away from today without hearing more about Stephen Hawking, or being asked more about Stephen Hawking. And I'm going to do the same thing as we did with Jim and just see if there's a question out there for you now before we move on to Gaynor. So do we have any questions specifically for Graham? We've got Christopher Packwood up there.
Yes, Christopher Packwood. I also had the pleasure of, thanks to the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, or Churchill Fellowship, having 2 Archives by Fellowships, and one of them was spent opposite Graham. I shared a desk with Graham for quite some while, actually. And one of the things that was fascinating is, as we're all sort of former bifellows here, is meeting each other. And that's one of the great values of the archives. We actually meet people doing things that we're not experts in ourselves. I mean, I didn't know much about atomic physics, as Graham can affirm. But nonetheless, I remember Gaynor as well, from, as she and I were on a team together, where we actually beat the undergraduates, which was slightly embarrassing. So is that something that other people find? That one of the great advantages of the Archive Centre is meeting other historians, other archivists, people doing things that you haven't thought of yourself, and being inspired by what other people are doing to do something better. So it's a learning. You can learn from the other archivists. You can learn from the archivists, of course, and learn from the other people as well.
Yeah, I should say, Gaynor we're going to hear from in a minute. It was great to meet her, and of course I heard about James's work through. So yes, this is a great place to find, particularly in Churchill matters. But perhaps I should have stressed there's plenty of other archives as well where there's a great deal of expertise. All of it is hugely valued. Archives on their own, right? They're very valuable, but so much is added by people who have expertise in the content. So I'm deeply grateful for that.
So maybe just to build on that question then, and to take it out beyond other Archive by Fellows, given the nature of your research and the fact that you're crossing that sort of history of science boundaries, how important was it for you to be able to speak to the scientists here at Churchill College?
Well, I'm not going to insult my fellows here. 70%, I believe, very important. And they took a close interest in it too. I mean, throughout my association with the college, it's been critical for me to have with friends and colleagues, people who have expert in a whole wide range of initiatives. So yes, I couldn't recommend it more.
Excellent. And on that note, we will move on. So, we've covered the archives of politicians and scientists, but the Archive Centre also has the papers of key diplomats. In fact, we host the British Diplomatic Oral History programme, about which we're going to be hearing more tomorrow. But our archival collections include the papers of Sir Eric Phipps, amongst many others. Sir Eric Phipps was British ambassador in Berlin in the mid-1930s, and then went to Paris before the outbreak of the Second World War. Gaynor Johnson, until recently a professor of international history at the University of Kent, is an expert on the British Foreign Office and British foreign policy very much during this period. And Gaynor came here in, I think, 2010.
That's right.
To research editing a volume of Phipps's diaries, which are a wonderful resource for that period. I, as it happens, remember meeting Eric Phipps's daughter. And her telling me that one of her earliest memories was sitting on the stairs at the residency in Berlin when Adolf Hitler arrived for a visit, and the fact that he then took her on his knee. So yes. One of her earliest memories is sitting on the dictator's knee.
Yeah, she told me the same story.
Yeah.
And she said it's deeply creepy. She said he patted me on the head, and she thought perhaps that was going to be some kind of strange blessing. But yes.
Okay. So, Gaynor, over to you.
Okay, yes. In fact, I too met Sir Eric's daughter here because the archive very generously, perhaps we could move on to my next slide, please, because it's got a picture of, shameless bit of self-publicity, of my book. And the Archive Centre very kindly did a book launch for me here. for Our Man in Berlin, which is the book which you possibly see on the left side of the screen. And I think her name was Mary, I think her name was. She came in and she was the absolute image of her father. And it was really strange, this lady coming in. She introduced herself to me and I said, I know exactly who you are. It was, having only ever seen rather grainy pictures of her father, it was remarkable to see this, you know, genetic connection, if nothing else, with her father. And as Alan said, I was here in the spring term of 2010, and I came here probably about midway through my career as an international historian, diplomatic historian. And I've spent most of my career one way or another writing about diplomats and more recently Foreign Office officials. So my time here was front and centre really of very central to the work that I did. I didn't really want to necessarily give you a seminar on Sir Eric Phipps, but there are a few things that we perhaps do need to note about him. The papers here, the main part of the collection is the diary, which exists in two manuscript folders, and it's kind of supplemented by some wonderful family letters. And in fact, it's kind of characteristic of a lot of the collections here. They very often have perhaps one particularly important central anchoring point with this kind of sense of a surrounding collection of documents. And of course his diary, I mean, we all perhaps think of a diary as being something we maybe keep online nowadays, or even in our back pockets, where we perhaps note you know, mundane kind of appointments and so on. But this diary was actually fairly unusual. It wasn't kept on a daily basis. It's not a list of his appointments. It's not even actually a list of what you might call informal and perhaps not necessarily very discreet comments on his contemporaries, unlike perhaps the diaries of Sir Alexander Cadogan, which is a rather different animal altogether. But rather the Phipps diary is actually a collection of his official dispatches. So it's a kind of just a kind of routine collection of his dispatches that he sent to the Foreign Office. So in that sense, they provide a very important insight into his official mind, into the way he saw, because he became ambassador to Paris in 1933, the year that Adolf Hitler, of course, came to power. And he left Berlin in 1937. So at that period of time, obviously just before the outbreak of the Second World War, you get one man's professional and personal gradual realization and insight into the motives behind not just Hitler, but the Third Reich as well. And one of the things that comes out in this also is that he is doggedly opposed to any form of appeasement, policy of appeasement. Anybody who studied the 1930s will know what a central, important and controversial subject that is. I think also the diary is important because it tells us in a concise form what the Foreign Office knew, what they were told. We've got that in a very kind of coherent kind of way. But I didn't really want to, let's say, talk to you at great length about Eric Phipps. My brief is also to talk about what the lessons were that I learnt being a By Fellow. And I think number one, and possibly this will not surprise any of you, given what I've just said, is it provided a reminder of the importance of studying individual people in history. And we've obviously heard a lot today about very, very eminent people, so globally important people like Winston Churchill. But people like Eric Phipps representing the government, but also people in general, the officials within the Foreign Office, are important. And I think it's important too because within the trends of diplomatic history, diplomatic historians often coming under pressure to be more rooted in social science, in international relations, and trying to look at diplomacy in the big picture context. And there's some merit to that, and I think there's some importance to that, and I certainly embrace that to a large extent. But at the end of the day, diplomacy is about human interaction. It's about interpersonal discussion, and it's about what one person makes of another and how they read them. I think another thing that I did too is the way in which there's a kind of network of people. Diplomats operate within networks, and you see, probably more than any other archive in the world, I would think, the interconnectedness of the networks between politicians and diplomats. Very important in terms of continuity, very important in terms of thinking about diplomatic culture, foreign office culture in this particular case. And I think, looking at my slide there, another important context to this was my time looking at the diaries of Sir Alexander Cadogan. And as you can see, I certainly can't take the credit for having edited those. I mean, they were edited by David Dilks in the 1960s. But again, something else, diaries like that have shaped the historiography, the literature on the origins of the Second World War. And I like to think that in a more modest way, possibly, my our man in Berlin has done something similar. So I think this process of being a By Fellow, it enabled me to see and think about the interconnectedness of diplomatic networks. And it was also gave me an opportunity, and it's interesting what Graham has just said, and indeed Christopher's comment. It gave me an opportunity to talk to like-minded and think about like-minded people. I met Professor Reynolds, for example, who's here in the audience, and I also spent many a happy hour with the now sadly late Dr. Zara Steiner, who was very much the grande dame of my field as a diplomatic historian. And it's been lovely being in Cambridge for the last few days, revisiting some of the places where I met her. So that was a huge thing for me. I also think that it's important to think. I think another strength of this archive centre, and it's been said already, but I want to pay my own tribute to Alan and his leadership. I think it's important to note that the archive team, not just Alan but his colleagues, you actually value historians. I've worked in. I know it's bizarre, isn't it?
Surely not.
You do because I've worked in many archives, and I don't know what my colleagues, perhaps in the audience or on the panel here. Sometimes I felt as though I've been there under sufferance. Sort of people have said to me, well, okay, we'll let you have a look at it this time, kind of thing, as though they were doing me some kind of favour, and as though they perhaps think that, obviously, understandably, people are concerned with preservation and conservation and so on, but actually making the archives accessible and usable is very important. And also, even more importantly, and this event is demonstration of this, you kept in touch with us all. There is a community of us, and you value what we've done, you follow up with what we've done. I say you very kindly organised a book launch for me for my our man in Berlin. So you don't just come here and spend a happy 8 weeks working away. I described this to Graham at the time as I'm like a kid in a candy store here. It was just so fantastic, all the range of opportunities that I had. But you keep in touch with us, and I'm hoping that this event will lead to even more connections between the three of us, the four of us, and perhaps obviously members of the audience. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you, Gaynor. I suppose it raises the question of whether we, the Archive Centre team, attach different values to different historians. In which case, your value has just gone up.
Oh, thank you.
So do we have a specific question for Gaynor? Well, perhaps I can get the... I do. And that's, I mean, you've looked at a number of different diaries, and you spoke about Eric Phipps, and you spoke about Alexander Cadogan's diary. And it seems to me that one of the key things with diaries is the motivation, what's prompting someone to keep that diary. Yeah. How important is that to you as a historian, and how does it influence your approach to the source material?
Oh, well, why people keep a diary, and I think is always an interesting thing. I think in whatever context that you look at it. I think Phipps's diary of his Berlin dispatches, he started to compile. He died in 1945, so he died, I think, just a few months before the end of the Second World War, and he started to compile his diary in the early 1940s, and he did so, I think, partly because he wanted, obviously, to have it on the record that he had warned the Foreign Office about Hitler and about the Third Reich. I think also another reason why he wrote his diary was because he'd also written a political or a diplomatic memoir, if I can call it that, called Light and Shade in Paris, which was about his time in Paris. And I think he wanted to kind of balance the two out. But why he wrote it, I think he was very keen to make sure, as I say, that it would become evident after the war that there had been people who had warned the Foreign Office about what was likely to come. And I remember again talking to Sir Eric's daughter, Mary, and we actually got the original manuscript out of the diary and we showed it to her. And she sort of, if you look at the original, it's a typewritten thing, but it's got lots of handwritten marginalia in it, lots of scribblings. And we showed it to Sir Eric's daughter, and she said, "Oh, that's my mother's writing." So the two of them, and Lady Phipps, I think, was his second wife, was quite a lot younger than Sir Eric. And I think possibly with an eye to posterity, he was thinking that it would be she who would be his literary executor and so on. But it was obvious from reading the annotations that this was, in a sense, a two-handed kind of interpretation of the Berlin story. But the fact that they were his official dispatches, I think, is the important thing. As far as I know, he wasn't actually someone who wrote lots of chatty, informal letters. If you read the diary, I'm not suggesting you necessarily should buy it. It's absurdly expensive to buy, but it's available, obviously, to view here. There's lots of extremely witty, funny insights. It's one of these things where he was actually criticised by some of his contemporaries for being a bit of a lightweight. You know, he's always joking. He's always kind of quipping. But when you actually look at what he actually says, one of the most powerful ways he communicates the idea of the threat posed by the fascist dictators is by starting out by regaling some kind of funny story, some anecdote, and it draws you in and makes you want to read what he's got to say. But there's always a punchline, there's always a sting in the tail, there's always something that says, but, you know, joking apart, these people are dangerous, etc., etc. And I think that really packs a punch. I think a lot of it's the style. I don't know, it's a slightly rambling answer, but I don't know if it answers your question. But
It does, and I think it sets us up perfectly now for, we've just got about 10 minutes for a wider discussion, and obviously we've covered an incredible number of subjects in this discussion. Do we have further questions or thoughts from the audience? Your opportunity. Okay, well, I'll start with a question. Oh, we have a question over here. So.
Sorry, Bonnie Soanes again, a political journalist, but you talk about the importance of diaries, but also the plethora of technical information now. It's something that you've all mentioned, that there's much more information, much easier to capture, for instance, politicians and tweets. Can you give me an idea of how, given the sort of mammoth task there now is to writing someone's biographies, how you would go about that in terms of a modern politician? How do you capture that information these days?
You haven't been working on a modern politician, you have been working on a modern scientist, Graham. Do you want to come into that first?
Yeah, it actually does get harder, I have to say, because I'm just thinking, if you're writing a biography of someone, I don't know, in the 17th century, you look at the kind of media you have to deal with. Most of it is written or what have you. Then you have the photographic element. Now, just zooming ahead, who could write a politician's memoir, right? Unless you have his or her WhatsApp messages, right? I mean, maybe we should set up an Isabel Oakeshott Fellowship or something like that for you to curate them. But no, the number of sources now, right, that you have, that a biographer has at his or her not disposal necessarily, because they may be hidden from them, but it's a good deal more, but potentially more rewarding. But I do, in my little thing with Hawking, the richest part for me, perhaps is showing my age, but his parents' diaries, right, written on the day he was born. 2 days after he was born, and his father talking about when he met Hitler, not met him, but saw him in a hotel doorway. It sends a chill down. But then you move way ahead now, and you see Hawking on Twitter, you see him on Facebook, you see him on the Chinese version of Twitter, and I started to realise, and I don't, this is a few weeks ago, do I know enough about this, about his personality? And then you start thinking about more complicated questions like, did he actually write those tweets? I mean, so I think the thing is potentially is richer, but is quite a bit more challenging than it was, say, 50 years ago.
Jim, you must have been wrestling with some of these issues with your students until fairly recently.
You mean the challenges of AI?
I was thinking of political science students wrestling with modern collections.
Well, that's certainly true. I guess most of my students find a kind of a different problem, even more acute, in dealing with trying to understand something Churchill wrote, for instance, because many of my classes have drawn on Churchill's books, and often he's referring to things they simply don't know anything about. And I think one of the most satisfying parts of the research for them and for me doing it is trying to figure out what one can learn by clues that are in these books but have to be interpreted. One of the things Churchill often did was to refer to books he had read or articles, and very often without mentioning the author, or sometimes he quotes a bit of it but doesn't give the source. And the internet, which is hugely helpful and endlessly distracting and time-wasting, and also often unreliable, has gotten to be bigger and bigger, and for this particular kind of research is a huge help, because as more and more things are included in it, it becomes considerably easier to figure out what the source of those kinds of quotations or glancing references might have been. And from that, one can figure out, for instance, what a constant reader Churchill was of a whole variety of different kinds of information and sources, and whether they were novels, poems, or, as Graham was saying, various kinds of technical information. He had a tremendous interest in all those things. I mean, beginning with reading all those newspapers before he got dressed for lunch.
Okay, Gaynor?
Yeah, I actually wrote a biography of a chap called Lord Robert Cecil, who was a conservative unionist politician in the Edwardian period, and probably more well known to international historians anyway as one of the leading lights, the British leading lights in the League of Nations. And I remember going to look at his papers, which were not here actually, they're in the British Library, and there was something like 200 boxes of these things, and I thought, I'm never going to get through this, it's hopeless. So what I decided to do, and also he was one of these people who, even more so like people like Winston Churchill, whose range of interests and involvements seem to be infinite. Well, and I came to the conclusion that I was going to have to be very selective early on. You know, I was not going to be able to write every single dimension to every single thing, and nor was it going to provide a coherent argument if I tried to do that. So I deliberately honed it down to 2 or 3 strands, albeit major strands, and looked at it in that particular way. But obviously it all depends on the subject matter and the papers available. I mean, we're all modern historians, and if anything, we tend to have an embarrassment of riches, don't we, rather than a dearth of them. So it's very often about what you leave out as much as what you include when you write, well, any study, but particularly a biography.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm conscious of the time, but I'm keen not to leave anyone out, and I know we have a further question from Lord Boating.
Yes, my time as a politician and then a diplomat predates WhatsApp, but it does include emails. And I was never allowed as a minister at any level, from Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State to Chief Secretary and Cabinet Minister, I was never allowed access to my own emails at all. So I was never permitted to email any of my colleagues or anyone else officially. And of course I didn't. But I was permitted indeed required as a High Commissioner to send dispatches in email form. And there was a tradition in the Foreign Office at that time that your last dispatch was completely untrammeled by any consideration as to what the government of the day, the principal secretary, or anyone else wanted to hear. You could say completely what was on your mind and draw strands together from your time in office. The Foreign Office has now abolished that last dispatch. And I wonder what that says to the panel about the way things are today.
Well, I think what it says to me is that there is certainly a much greater concern within government about the implications of freedom of information and data protection, and a concern about things being recorded, which I think is a great shame. But I will defer to my other panellists if anyone wants to come in.
Yes, I would say that it was a loss that you were not able to do that. I think, again, thinking back to the Phipps diary and also the the range of different sources that I've read from other diplomats in the Foreign Office archive. Their valedictory dispatches were often some of the most interesting, insightful, and also useful to their successors. You know, I've spent 5 years getting to know these people. I've spent 5 years working with these people. And these are my insights, and so the handing over to the successor, it would be very useful. I'm sure many of us who perhaps changed jobs, and we've actually had a briefing from our predecessors, it's been invaluable. And very often it's small details as well as big details that prove to be useful.
Jim, you wanted to come in quickly?
Well, I just think it's a frequent thing, especially nowadays, that people don't bother to understand the importance of the kind of connection that Gaynor's just been talking about. And even institutions, important institutions, aren't careful to look to their beginnings and keep good records of their history. And in that respect, the Churchill Archives is really a brilliant exception.
Okay, well, that's an excellent note on which to finish. I don't think we've got the power to reinstate the diplomatic final dispatch, but we do, of course, have the British Diplomatic Oral History Programme, a programme to interview senior ambassadors and diplomats, and we will be hearing more about that from Patrick Salmon, Abby Wright, and their guests tomorrow. So this is something that we can pursue then. It's now lunchtime. Lunchtime is over in the main dining hall. It's a buffet lunch. You're all welcome to join. And we will reconvene here at 2 o'clock.
Thank you.